thank you for joining us tonight. We are in a series titled Money, Marriage, and the Madness of Raising Kids. You can find the money part and the marriage part on our YouTube channel if you'd like to go and watch those 3 weeks each on that content. Today we are starting a 3-week conversation on parenting, on the madness of raising kids. The reason we're doing a series like this is because, these are usually high stress experiences, high stress relationships in normal life, and now in the global pandemic, when we're virtually schooling our kids, when our kids are constantly bored because they can't play with friends and they can't go outside and they can't leave the house, and things are getting tense in households. I know you've shared this with us. I know that we've shared it with you guys. Things are getting tense in households, and today we're going to talk about the madness of raising humans, or more simply put, parenting. As most of us have started school virtually alongside working from home, trying to manage schedules, we have this huge responsibilities to not merely tolerate our children, but to raise them up to be people whom are fully human, help them grow into God's design for them. It's so easy to fall back and just, I'm going to tolerate my children. They can become who they want to become, whatever. I'm not going to put the effort in. I'm not going to take responsibility. But as parents, it is a huge responsibility. Sometimes this responsibility comes with a lot of delight. Sometimes it comes with complete madness, but it is always a responsibility. It's a responsibility that begins in the womb, actually, as we develop visions for whom our children are going to be. And all of us actually do this if you think about it. We all have a vision for who we believe and desire our children to become. We cast hopes and dreams upon our children. And this vision, these hopes, these dreams, this dictates how we parent them. We cast a vision for who our children will become, and we set them on a path in order to get to that place, in order to become those people. Some people choose to micromanage that path. Some people choose to say, I got a vision for you. It's not that all important. I don't really care about it a whole lot, but go and be whom you want to be. Some of us take extremes on both ends of it. Some of them are concerned and interested in the path than other parents are. They don't pay much attention to their children because for them the vision maybe isn't all that detailed. But the spectrum of how we parent and why we parent, it is wide and it is varied. And we all parent differently. We parent different because we are parented differently, and we have varying worldviews, and some of us have help in parenting. Others of us, even though there may be 2 parents in the household, we have the additional help of grandparents or aunts and uncles, of helping to raise our children. Of course, we are always the parents, but we have people who speak into our children's lives and help them become the people that we desire them to become. 20 years ago, there were only 4 main styles of parenting. As you can see on this spectrum, only 4 of these were prevalent 20 years ago, but as the world changes and new worldviews are introduced and millennials are now parents, philosophies and practices on what it means to be a parent is changing. And now there are at least 12 identified parenting styles by psychologists. So see if you can identify or relate to some of these. Here's a quick rundown of the 12. The narcissistic parent. These are parents who live vicariously through their kids. The parents' needs are held up above everyone else's. And any growing independence of the child will be considered a threat. And so these parents want to control their children and micromanage their children's behavior and choices. The helicopter parent. Parents who hover over their children as they live their life. Usually these parents also assist in making decisions for their parents. They too try to micromanage what their parents are doing, but a little more freedom for the kids, but we hover over our children, making sure that they're making good choices. The authoritarian parent. A high demand for rules and expectations, but little response or care. Very stern, very punitive. So high demand for boundaries, high demand for rules, but little concern, little care. The lawnmower parent. You mow down a challenge or blockade or hardship for your child. You'd hate for your child to have to experience a challenge. You'd hate for your child to fail, and so you do everything in your power to make sure that your child succeeds all the time. The attached parent focuses on physical and emotional attachment from birth, which can create a codependency. The slow parent, right? Life is a rat race, and so slow parents, they leave room for margin. We make sure that we carve out that time for us to have our dinners and our family time. We make sure that that's a very important principle. We try not to over cram our schedule, but we have pace and margin within our relationships. The authoritative parents, high demands for rules and expectations as well, but there's a lot of response and a lot of care. Very sensitive to our failures, and when we can't meet those demands, we meet each other with grace. The positive parent focuses on building a strong relationship built on communication and respect. Asks the question why a lot. Why are you behaving this way? Why are you doing this? The permissive parent, very few rules and expectations on children. These parents don't tend to like to set boundaries. They're soft, they're caring, they're responsive, they're sensitive to their children's needs. There's a lot of emotional support that goes into this. It's really more of a friendship than it is a parenting. The spiritual, it's not so much that we're helping our children become spiritual people, but it's really helping a child determine what feels right to them and live into that feeling. We shouldn't let society feed our children answers about what it is right, and we should let our children determine what is right and create their own answers. And so if your children want to identify as a different gender than they are, then free parents or spiritual parents tend to let them investigate and help them come up to their own conclusions and answers about who they are. The uninvolved parent, low control, no rules or boundaries, and no emotional support. Coexistence, really, but little else. You're really more like a roommate than you are a parent. And then on the far end of the spectrum is the toxic parent, the abusive, emotionally, physically, spiritually, or sexually abusive. So take a moment and ask yourself where your default is on this spectrum. Are there some of these styles that you can see yourself sliding to during times of stress? But when you think you're at your healthiest, my friends, when you think you're at your healthiest, where do you tend to fall on the spectrum? Where do you go on the spectrum? Now, another way of looking at these styles is from the perspective of boundaries. Boundaries are an essential part of any relationship. When boundaries aren't present, things can go horribly wrong because those in relationships are free to do whatever they want, and typically when we're free, our default is selfish, which always hurts us and it also hurts others. But when they're overly present, relationships can be stifling and confining and imprisoning. But right relationships thrive within proper boundaries. Proper boundaries are good and needed and necessary. And the reason we struggle with this so often is because our culture lives in a contractual world. We live in a contractual culture based on law, rather than a covenantal culture based on grace. But proper, right, meaningful, and life-giving relationships are always covenantal relationships. You see, without covenant, you don't have life-giving relationships and you don't have family. You can have people who love each other, but unless those persons are in agreement by which they are going to live into that life, into that relationship, you have nothing binding you together in a meaningful way. All you have is really a bunch of people sharing the same space. You have a bunch of people who might be cordial towards one another or kind towards one another, and they're sharing common interests or a geographical location, but there's nothing binding them together in a meaningful relationship. So I'm going to argue that meaningful, life-giving, abundant, caring, and loving relationships exist, and we are committed to knowing each other and being known and still loving each other in the end. It is when relationships exhibit the fullness of both truth and grace, this unconditional, self-sacrificial love anchors our relationships to the point where I love you even though I know all of your junk. That we communicate regularly and we're honest and we're open and there's truth, and despite who you are and despite what you've done, despite all the junk that you bring into this relationship, I love you, and vice versa, you love me despite all the junk that I bring into the relationship. I love you despite knowing all the junk, and I'm willing to give of myself for your betterment, and you are willing to do the same for me. This is what is known as reciprocity. Reciprocating love is what is given, right? I give. It's like movement to the right, and as I receive love, it's movement back to the left, and it creates a circle of movement. You get that imagery, right? You get this circle of movement as I pour out, and you pour out, and I pour out into you, and you pour out into me. It is a cyclical relationship. And so it creates a circle. It creates a boundary, if you will. Within the circle is where the covenant relationship resides. Think of like a ball that is spinning, right? A ball that is spinning is reciprocating, it's going back and forth, right? The ball goes, it goes around, it goes, it comes around, it goes around. But that ball is always anchored in the middle at the center. The ball establishes the barriers, that circular pattern that it creates, the ball going around, it creates the barrier which the reciprocating love relationship can function within. And the reason that most relationships, marriages, friendships, parental to child relationships, struggle is because the boundaries are either control, as we've talked about, or and confine, control and confine, or they don't exist. But relationships need playing fields. Every relationship intrinsically has a playing field. Most just never take the time to define what the boundaries of that playing field are. Covenant is the established or defined parameters of a relationship. That's really what a covenant is. Covenant sets up the boundaries and the limitations of our behavior within the context of relationship. But the center of a covenant relationship, a proper relationship or right relationship that I am arguing for, is always going to be love. Love, in other words, makes the relationship go round. Now, the funny thing about this is that we all have these parameters with every relationship that we are part of. Every relationship has an assumed standard, an assumed set of expectations for what it means to be in a relationship, what right behavior looks like within this relationship. Some have very deliberate standards imposed, like you've been to a marriage ceremony, for instance, and you watch this husband and wife define what they are going to be about, the expectations, the standard for right relating in this relationship. That is the vows that they are making. They set the playing field, they set the boundaries, they set the parameters for what it means to be in a relationship, but we don't typically do that in most of our relationships. Consider the parent-to-child relationship. I doubt you have a list of what it means to be a child in your house, under your roof, and under your authority as a parent, but your children do things that hurt them and hurt themselves and hurt you and hurt someone else all the time, right? I mean, raising children wouldn't feel like madness if this weren't the case. Our kids are lazy sometimes. They're unconcerned. They're apathetic. They don't do what they're told. They don't come when they're asked. They aren't home on time. They don't. But we do have expectations as parents. We give our kids screen time limits, we give them curfews, we give them responsibilities in order to get their allowances. We have expectations of them. Every relationship has boundaries for what it means to be in a relationship, and every relationship has a center that anchors that boundary. That center, even if it is an assumed center, determines the parameters, the boundaries, and the expectations of the relationship. The difficulty we have with most relationships, and this includes marriage relationship, it includes parent-to-child relationships, is that these boundaries are assumed. Our centers then are subjective. Where we're coming from, where we're living out of, these are subjective. The center point which determines the parameters of our relationships are relative to the thoughts and the habits and the desires of the people within the relationship. So I know this is like this relational theory thing is kind of dense at points, but each person within the relationship establishes their own parameters for appropriate relationship with all the other people that they are in a relationship with. And this is why relationships are so hard. What you actually end up with is two sets of expectations and standards for what it means to be in a relationship with another person. Parents do this to kids, kids do this to parents, and we try to do relationship from two different perspectives with two different expectation sets. And this is why parenting sometimes feels like madness. Most people in relationships simply do not function off of the same center. This is why marriages fail more often than they succeed, because those involved aren't truly willing to submit to the promises that they made. Their centers are relative. And clearly the couple hasn't agreed to the same foundational center that was to determine the parameters and the boundaries of their relationships. See, they're approaching the relationship from two different foundations, from two different centers, from two different expectation sets. And we see this also in parenting and children. So in order to move together into a healthy, life-giving, loving, and caring relationship, we need to approach one another from the same center of understanding, and understanding that the parameters of what it means to be in a relationship with one another are defined by that center. In other words, if you haven't clearly communicated what your expectations are for your children in your household, if you haven't clearly communicated what it means to be a child, and what your hopes and your dreams are, and why you are raising your children the way you are raising, then they are going to assume something about what it means to be in a relationship in this household, and they are going to live their way, you are going to live your way, and you are going to clash. Relational theory based on a covenantal model. See, we need covenant relationships built on love as the covenant center in order for relationships to be effective. And the boundaries then need to be communicated. Communication about life and living and human and being human, and expectations, these need to be clear, they need to be concise, and they need to be communicated. So to recap, covenants include the stated expectations for what it means to be in relationship. Some of these covenants are unilateral. That means that the person in authority makes the covenant expectations, that you determine what it means to be in relationship within this household. Some of the relationships can be bilateral, meaning that you together, you and your child in this case, would come together to make those expectations. Covenants are therefore lived within agreed upon parameters. You have your boundary for what it means to be in a relationship. You have the playing field, and it's marked and it's clear, and here are the boundary lines for what it means to be in right relationships. Covenants are not contracts, but there are still consequences for when one party steps outside the agreed upon parameters. But unlike contracts based on law, covenants are based on grace, always leaving an open door back into relationships. So, I know that was really dense, and I apologize for that, but the purpose of it all is simply to say that we as parents have a responsibility to raise our children in such a way that they are going to be full of life, abundant life, in the way that God had designed them and created them to be. And the clearest and most concise way to help them do that is by establishing very clear and concise boundaries for what it means to be in a relationship within this household, what it means to be in a relationship, that communication piece about what the boundary lines are, what this playing field is. Here are my expectations for you as a child within this household. And if they choose to step outside those boundary lines, then there are consequences, repercussions for doing so. But it's not like you're cut off from the family. There is grace always to enter back into relationship, right relationship. And Paul talks about this in his letter to the Colossians when he addresses the parental family relationship, parental child relationship. He says, "Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. And parents, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged." And so Paul is interested in covenantal parenting. But as the originators of the covenant, parents, you are the ones who need to lead your children. You are the ones who need to lead your children. You are then to be the first to serve. You are the first to go. You are the first to warn, first to help, first to love, first to contribute, first to give. We must be the model. In other words, we must lead the way. We start the ball spinning, and then it is reciprocated back to us. We give, we pour out first. That is a responsibility of the parent. And when that ball begins to spin, it creates a playing field that is vital for a healthy relationship between us and our children, where these parameters and these rules and expectations can then take place. See, my responsibility as a parent is to help my children become the most human that they can possibly be, and the best versions of themselves as possible. And I do this through being in a love relationship with them. We've created this field for where this relationship is to exist, and when those parameters are breached, yes, there are consequences. But a covenantal relationship with your children assumes that those parameters and those consequences are known. That you don't just surprise kids that they disobeyed a rule they had no idea that they weren't supposed to break. They are known. And so we talk with our children and we tell them that our hope for them is for them to become the most loving, respectful, and kind and hardworking people that they could be, the very, very best versions of themselves, that they would look like Christ and be self-sacrificial and generous in their love. And if they choose to be rude or unkind or hit or yell at their siblings or anyone, we will take away X, Y, and Z. Or they will sit in their room in isolation. If they choose to step outside the parameters of what it means to be in right relationship, they will experience the stated consequence of doing so. It is communicated. If they don't know what the consequence is, if they don't know where the boundary line is, then do not We can't be hard on them or challenge them when they step outside of it. See, I tell my kids at dinner all the time that if they choose to get off their seats and to go and play and run around, then there are going to be consequences. And so if they sit still, then they'll be rewarded with a great time with the family, and they'll be rewarded with maybe dessert afterward. But if they choose to get up and to play and not sit still at dinner and converse with us about how their day was, then there will be consequences. And I have to follow through with that as a parent. That's a very important piece. The follow-through is a very important piece. We discuss what the parameters are, and we discuss what the consequences are, leaving them with the responsibility and the choice that they have the power to choose. If they stay put, they're rewarded, but if they choose to disobey, then they are disciplined. But here's a very important caveat to all this. Covenants aren't based on rules. Covenants are based on people. So when my children step outside our established parameters, they are not offending a list of rules somewhere. They are offending a father's heart. And this is so important, right? They offended a relationship established on love, not a contract on a piece of paper. Therefore, there is always grace offered. One of my children did something this past week that broke the parameters for what it meant to be in a relationship with me. And it hurt me. It hurt me as a father, and it hurt their mother as well. So we talked about it. We talked about what it means to be in relationship with people and how actions stepped outside of we didn't use this language, of course, but stepped outside of the parameters and the boundaries for what it meant to be in relationship. They stepped into the realm of being selfish. They stepped into the realm of where entitlement lives. They stepped into the realm of where being rude is and unkind, and where they are selfish. And out there, outside of the parameters of a self-sacrificial love for the betterment of another, that is where we hurt, and that is where we hurt others. Now, we didn't pull them aside and say, hey, do you remember how you broke rule number 23? No, we talked about how they were selfish in their choices. And it hurt people. And it didn't only hurt them, it didn't only hurt other people, but it hurt them. And because they had offended a relationship, right? Not a rule on a board, not a piece of paper. They offended a relationship. They knew exactly what they needed to do. They needed to approach the person that they had offended, and they needed to seek forgiveness, because they did not break a rule on a sheet of paper. They broke someone's heart. They hurt somebody. Later that night, I was tucking them into bed. I told them that I was proud of them. Not because they were perfect that day, not because they had not failed, or that because they weren't selfish, or that because they were perfect, but because they did what was necessary to regain relationship, and I extended them grace. Grace brought them back into proper relationship in the household. And here are things. There are times in this parent-child relationship where this is reversed. There are times when I don't love my children as I should, that I'm not committed to the boundaries that we've established as I should, that I step outside of love, and I am rude, and I am unkind, and I am not generous towards them. And I step outside of the parameters of what it means to be in right relationship with them. And there are times when I then need to seek their forgiveness. Yes, as a parent, I need to go seeking the forgiveness of my children because I had offended them. And they then need to be the ones to extend me grace. That's a very humbling position to be in, but oftentimes I will go to my children seeking their forgiveness because I did not parent them well. See, covenants are not like contracts. If you breach a contract, it's over. It's broken. It's done. Covenants are based on love relationship, and therefore will always leave a gracious door open to restoration of that relationship to take place. Covenants are based on grace. Yes, we are going to step outside the parameters and the boundaries regularly and often, but grace is always going to be that open door inviting people back in. It is, and on this side of eternity will always be messy. Parenting a person, raising a person will always be messy. It's like God trying to bring us along into our likeness of Jesus, right? It is a messy, messy process, but it is one He is committed to, and therefore it is one that we must be committed to as well. We must be intentional in our parenting. We must commit to living inside the circle and constantly inviting our children back into it. And as we step out of it, seeking their forgiveness as they invite us back into it as well. And as we learn then to become more human, as we become more like Jesus, we are teaching our children to do the same. We lead the way. We start the ball spinning. We go first. Next week, we are going to look at one very popular proverb in Scripture that helps us understand the very important role of parents as we begin and we continue this discussion. But let me recap a couple helpful things for you today. My friends, relationships are always covenantal. Therefore, they exist within the confines of parameters, and if those parameters are not clearly defined and clearly explained and clearly communicated, then you're going to have a very, very hard relationship on your hands, because you will approach the relationship from two different perspectives. And when somebody steps outside of that boundary, grace is the open door, inviting them back into it. And we, as parents, must be the leaders in this relationship. We must begin we must begin to love our children, be generous towards our children, sacrificial towards our children, if we expect them to be the same. If we want our children to be loving, then we should model love. If we want them to be generous, we should model generosity. If we want them to be caring and kind and patient, then we must model this for our children. We are the ones who must go first. We start the ball spinning. Hope you can join us next week as we continue our series on parenting. Good luck, my friends. Go, love your children well, model it well, and communicate it well. And be gracious towards yourself and towards them. God bless you all.